All right, so I want to start this panel with a little social experiment. I'm going to pick someone at random, you, because you're close to me. That's not technically randomness. Assume you run a country. You are a leader in utter and complete control. Okay. What is the system you put in place to allow someone to replace you?
The system I put in place to allow someone to replace me. So allow is in like...
Your people demand that at some point there'll be someone else in your job.
Or you'll die and you need someone to follow you.
Yeah.
Do you require a serious answer?
No. I mean, I think there is only one answer. What's your system?
The only answer is Thunderdome.
Combat.
Yeah.
It's combat.
So the answer for most people is I don't make one, right?
correct.
I don't make one.
Because then you can be replaced.
Then you can be replaced, and you might be. So now let's assume your people. I'll go to you since you have a question or an answer. Let's assume.
Mandatory execution after you leave office.
Well, now why would you put that in place? You're the person there. That's a terrible system. So if you're only going to leave office when you die, what is the system you put in place to replace you in that case? Who replaces you? Yeah.
Well, I would have to choose the person I trust most. Probably be family, right?
That's right. Maybe your children, right? Yeah.
But what's the inherent problems that we can see as game designers with this?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't know if that's a problem.
Yeah, that's not a problem. So the problem there, obviously, is your kids are physically close to you. But you're right, that's what people do. And that's why history has worked the way it's done from a governmental standpoint, right? And at some point, we decided, some people decided it's a bad system, and some people took some power, and they said, you know what, we're going to have a system where we vote people or we assign people. If you're from a subsection of people, you can be a leader now, however that works. So the reason I use that as an example is what we're going to talk about in this panel is the design of politics as a game. So we're going to use game design terms to talk about politics. This is not a panel about policy. I won't be talking about marginal tax rates and why they're good or bad or any of that stuff. Super exciting.
Yeah, marginal tax rates was why I was here for too.
Gerrymandering is 2 core circle forwards and 2 punch buttons.
So gerrymandering is an effect of a rule. So it's worth talking about because there's no policy attached to gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is how do you win, right? And maybe it's not a problem. So, and I want to say why this is important real quick. So, our founding fathers were game designers. They made a game. Politics functions exactly like a game. There are winners, there are losers, there are consequences, there are rewards for winning, there are punishments for losing, which most games don't have other than maybe if you pay money to enter. And
it's regularly updated.
Yeah. Our patching mechanisms are less than ideal. So at some point, for example, in game mechanic speak, we talk about the term catch-up. Catch-up is a game mechanic that allows the player who is behind to get an advantage to maybe make the game more competitive. If you've any played Mario Kart, you've all played Mario Kart, you know that when you're losing in Mario Kart, you get better power-ups, right? It's a catch-up mechanic. So let's talk about civil rights for a second. Every civil rights movement is the addition of a catch-up mechanic. We have groups of people who are left behind, and we want to empower them so that maybe they can catch up. So civil rights movements, catch-up mechanic. And if we think of it that way, it's a very structural way to look at it. There's no, I don't know what the right term is here. It's not all positive because certainly some people want to win the game, so they don't want catch-up mechanics. The opposite of that in game mechanics is called snowball. If you're ahead in a game, you're given more power to be ahead. That's a good example of that.
I mean, basically the fact that you get 2 gerrymander districts if you're already ahead.
Yeah, and in a game it might be something like in poker, if you're playing at a poker table and you have more chips than everyone else, you have an advantage.
You gain plus.
You gain plus, yes, you gain plus. So if we look at those mechanics and we apply them to our system, we get things like gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is a snowball mechanic. The course of history, till recently, has been catch-up mechanics because we have people who are left out. All right, so I'd like to talk about the Founding Fathers for a second. If anyone says the Founding Fathers believed and they finish that sentence with a policy, they're lying. The Founding Fathers disagreed on so many things that one shot and killed another, and they made a musical about it. So yeah, the only things they agreed on
is the power of song.
They did agree on the power of song. Hey, anyone who can rap and waltz is pretty okay with me. So the the Founding Fathers only agreed on one thing, basically, that this system of your terrible country was bad, and that they wanted to put more catch-up mechanics into the system of how to run a country. They wanted the people with the power to not have power to decide who gets more power, right? So I know there's the same word 3 times in a sentence, but that's essentially what it boils down to. So let's talk about specific design goals. Give me a design goal that was the Founding Fathers had, specifically they were trying to accomplish that was successful. What are they good at? What do they do that worked?
Peaceful transfer of power.
Yes. Yeah. Most important point in American history to me, George Washington stepping down.
Yes, me too.
Yeah. He had a chance to be an emperor and he said no. Which that doesn't happen much in history, by the way.
It's actually, I think, the single most important thing he did, despite everything else he did, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Do y'all know this moment? He served 2 terms. He was told, if you want to, we can make you king. People don't respect presidents. The title of president was literally picked because it incurred no status.
and at the time, right, we aren't to the real Constitution. Like, the government is failing,
Yes.
and then
And then he said, I don't want to be emperor. It's the wrong thing to do. It's not why I fought these wars. I'm going to step down, and we're going to have a peaceful transference of power. And don't they read his speech like every year?
Yes.
Yeah, or every transfer of power. It's amazing. The Senate, I think, reads their speech every year. So he was all about the catch-up mechanic. So let me tell you some other goals they had, and we'll ask how you think they worked. One of the stated goals of the Constitution was to end up with no political parties.
solid.
Solid. Nailed that one. There's a great Alexander Hamilton quote about how we need to make a system that political parties don't exist. Give me the name of the person who created the first political party in America. Alexander Hamilton. Yeah. So the interesting part about what they tried to do, and all hats off, like these guys were working with no net. Like, I'm going to say a bunch of things that make me sound like the Founding Fathers totally didn't know what they were doing. They were at the cutting edge, the bleeding edge.
And given the fact that it's sort of worked for this long, like from a game design perspective, it's actually kind of incredible that they only really failed once, and
Yes.
then we basically had it work for 200 years, sort of, since then.
Yeah, we had one civil war.
Right. We had one civil war, one failed constitution, and other than that, we're pretty good.
Pretty good, yeah. The reason we all vote in one day, that was to discourage the creation of political parties. Because the assumption was nobody can organize themselves so well that they can all talk to everybody and coordinate who they're going to vote for. Because at the time, George Washington handed out beer before people voted. Like, that's what you did. You just, free beer, go vote. Vote for the guy that gave you beer.
Good system.
The good old days.
Now we don't even get the beer.
Oh, we get ads. That just doesn't seem right. All right, so see, what else was really good from the Founding Fathers, or what didn't work? Let's talk about gerrymandering for a second, because I don't know about you, but it is, in my mind, one of our larger snowball issues that we have to deal with.
And at some point, I think we should also talk about separation of powers, because I think that was a big...
Yeah.
And why we care about separation, why they cared about separation of powers, and did it work?
Yeah, so separation of powers. You did that one first. So how much power? We're called the United States of America. We're not the United
what?
People of America. Sorry. It's the S part in USA.
Whoa. Okay, cool. Got it.
Got it. So we are the United States of America, not the United People of America. Our original Constitution was not designed to make us a cohesive nation. It was designed to make us a cohesive nation when required because somebody was invading us or something. So we left a lot of power in the state's hands. A lot of power.
Including the power to tax, which it's bad when your federal government can't actually generate revenue.
Yes, that's not good.
Especially when it has massive war debt to cover.
Yeah. And they know that they might get in another war, which happened pretty quickly too. Yeah. And separation of powers has also led to interesting things being allowed. As the federal government has gained power, certain things have kept in the state purview. Technically, voting rights are in the state purview, right? We can have different voting laws. We do have subclasses of citizens. We like to pretend we don't, but we do. If you live in a certain state, you are treated as a different citizen by the state government, the government who has some authority over you, even if it's simple stuff. What's the price to put the plates on your car again, right? I have a different citizen status in that case because my state still matters.
I'm glad that you live in a state that still matters.
What? I live in Pennsylvania. Our votes count. That's all I'm saying. So, Electoral College. How and why did that come about?
So I think there's actually several different arguments on why this is, but fundamentally it's to, at least the broader argument is to preserve the power of the smaller states, right? Because they need to make a compromise and they need to get the smaller states on board to be part of this union. And to do that, they need to say, okay, it's the same reason we have 2 senators per state, right? That you guys will never have less than X power, so that way the big states can't just decide everything for this government. I might say I see other things going on there as well, but I'd love to hear your...
All right, so Electoral College is a fascinating legacy, right? It was a good idea. It answered the problem of the day that you just described.
And it also answered the problem of voting is complicated in a world without any mass communication. How do we approximately make this work, right?
Sure, yeah, for national offices, yeah, for presidency, how do we make this work?
Right.
I remember at that time, the Electoral College wasn't voted for directly, right? It was...
As electors,
It was electors, yeah. And they were picked by the state legislators, right? And at that point, the Senate wasn't voted on directly either, right? So something we all forget is like the idea that you vote for senators is not original, right? They were comfortable having many more snowball mechanics inside the state. They really wanted to preserve the snowball of the state. Last thing they wanted to do was have catch-up, except to allow the small states to keep their power, right? That was definitely a challenge to do, because right now, what's happened? If you live in California and you're voting for president, I don't care.
Right.
Apparently, if you live in Virginia and you vote for a state legislature, you should. Because film canisters still happen. So that's an interesting legacy. How many of you think that was, you know what happened, right? In Virginia, there was a state legislator, it was a tie, and it was decided by putting names in 35 millimeter film canisters.
Yep.
I don't know where they found those things. And put them in a bowl and pulled one out. And I hear a lot of people say, I can't believe this archaic system is being used. Who thinks that's an archaic, bad system? I'm curious. And I'm not going to tell you you're wrong or right if you do this, because it's just, I'm asking you if you feel. So there's a few people out there. How many think this is a totally rational way to decide how a country gets led? Okay, and some people have no opinion, that's fine. Yeah, so that's been done all the time. That happens at state level all the time. But it's usually in like the small jobs, the county tax assayer, 32 votes to 32 votes. This was 11,000 votes to 11,000 votes. So you should vote. Any mathematicians in the audience? Should I vote for president? Does my vote for president matter? Yeah.
You live in Pennsylvania, yeah.
Has the margin of error ever been 1 for a presidential election?
It's been negative. I mean,
to win a state. To win a state. Has a state ever gone by 1 vote? 1 human vote, not an elector vote. I don't think so.
The closest I remember is 398, I believe, in Florida, back in the Al Gore Bush.
Yeah. So, that's a fascinating thing, because now I want to talk about separation of powers real quick, because that brings up the Supreme Court in a really interesting way. So we know that if you put too much power into one person or one body of people, problems happen. And so we have this really elegant system of checks and balances. It's rock, scissors, paper for running a country. Right? Everybody has a check on one. Everyone is checked by one. The Supreme Court, when they ruled in the Gore-Bush case, only time in their history they ever said, this judgment does not set precedent for future judgments. That's fascinating and frightening.
Right.
That's frightening. What that means is the whole point of the Supreme Court is to make final decisions that stand going forward. And they said, we're going to make a decision, and the last thing we want to be known for is the decision we just made. I don't want this thrown back in my face ever again, because we don't know what we're doing. We have a 200-year-old document, 200-and-something-year-old document. We brag about how we have the oldest functioning
modern democracy.
Modern democracy. If you say that slowly, we have the oldest functioning democracy. It's like you could make the argument we haven't learned enough. Like, a founding father certainly expected there to be more constitutional conventions. That was assumed to be a regular occurrence. The ability to amend the Constitution was assumed for small issues, but they assumed that everything they did was going to be temporary and replaced by future generations who would know better. And then we took them and put them on a pedestal and said, Oh, you don't know the founding fathers, right? Did you see the Whigs, man? They were awesome.
How would this democracy be relative to, I guess, the Roman Empire, which I believe actually introduced some concepts of a democracy?
Absolutely. It didn't last, though. The Roman Empire fell apart. So yeah, the Roman Empire was obviously the place that people looked for inspiration to.
Also an empire, not a republic.
Well, they were a republic first.
They were called their own republic at that time, and it was only like 200 years.
Right, and I mean, the Athenian democracy also only about 200. Democracies really haven't made it much longer than the U.S. is currently at.
So we're like in soccer on injury time.
So we're falling apart nation.
Well, okay, so let's talk about game design versus game theory. So we have a game design, and I think it's actually pretty good and impressive for its time. It really was. We've patched it 20, how many amendments to the Constitution? 27 meaningful times. Well, some of those
Minus
are really, some of them are pretty small.
Prohibition, not prohibition. Is
Yeah.
we'll just wipe those.
Do over, yeah. And there's some that are, this is a holiday. But we have patched it. We haven't patched it recently. This is an interesting rule statement. Let's assume you were playing a game and you're a sport. I think the best analogy to political systems are professional sports. Because in professional sports, you have spectators. And you make decisions based on spectators. Right? So not only are we the source of the money for the NFL, if the game is not enjoyable for us, the NFL will change. Right? They will put in rules about no head hits. Even if that hurts a team. Right? If there's a team out there that's dominating football because they head hit everybody, right? Tough luck, right? They're going to change the rules for the spectators. We are the spectators, and that sounds like we're passive. But if things insult us, theoretically we have an amendment and we fix it. Anyone have an idea why we haven't had a serious amendment in, what was the last one? Not direct voting of,
I'll get you an answer.
yeah. What was it? What was the last one?
Oh, I don't know. I have an idea why.
Sure, why not?
Everything's pretty good.
No, that's a totally legit answer. Money in politics. Why do you mean by money? What is that? Why would that change how the spectators feel?
Well, it means that the people who make the rules are being paid based upon their campaign contributing.
It's been going on for hundreds of years. We had the super PACs were not a thing. Different names.
What have you stepped into?
Individuals with more money.
Yeah, okay, so the argument is the money the reason we're not changing because it's in somebody's best interest, financially, personally, if they don't change it. Well, the Founding Fathers certainly did not expect to have career politicians. They expected to be gentlemen farmers, come in, you serve an office, and then you go home. Right, that was the expectation at the time. Back there, do you have a different answer? Or yeah.
So you mentioned earlier how thinking about this from like a game design development where we patched this 27 times.
Yeah.
The reason we haven't patched it since then is because the people who are now the developers are the pro players. And they don't want to patch it because they've learned how to play the game well.
There's essentially two teams. Right, the big analysis is, do we have three branches of government or do we have two? Right, and we've moved towards two for sure. I would argue that curious your take on this, but my take would be the reason we haven't patched it is because we've reached a mass media level that the system breaks under. We now have the ability to communicate with everybody, and we use money to do so, for those who said money. And if you followed any large made-up social movements, like literally from whole fabric, you can think of them as conspiracy theories, but if you go back to, I heard this great story recently about the Klan, that sounded horrible, about how the Klan was hugely popular in Oregon back when it first got founded. And they did it by convincing people that the Catholics were being sent over from Europe, not because their countries were falling apart and they were poor and they needed a place to stay, but because the Pope ordered them to. And then the Pope was going to come over and overthrow the government. And there was even, like, in the newspaper, sightings of the Pope. This is hysterical. Building a house made out of gold in New York City, which is like, funny, I never saw it. There wasn't enough media there to be as effective as now. So you hear that story and you sound like, oh, the crazy teens or whenever this was that this happened. I could make the same argument that the fear over Sharia law coming to the United States was identical. It was essentially made up, And it worked. It convinced enough people. So if you want to protect the status quo because the status quo works for you, it's easier now than it's ever been. Yeah.
I mean, my thought is essentially the same, especially if we have reasons to entrench power, right? If you do want to protect the status quo, if you're part of it, and you're the one who gets to write the rules, and you now have a system where telling information that's false is minute for minute like easier than telling information that's true, then yeah, of course, that's where we end up.
Is lying against the rules in politics? Never has been. Like you're saying, lots of things that have been going on for a long time. The difference is the magnitude and the ease at which money works. I mean, who is it? Ben Franklin owned a printing press. He printed all kinds of crazy shit, like all kinds of nonsense.
Like a farmer's almanac.
Well, that part was good. Knowing when it's going to snow. What kind of witchcraft is that? Yes. Put your shirt on. Yeah.
Counter argument to the mass media is things like the NRA being able to affect the vote on gun control.
Yeah.
When you can clearly show that a large, overwhelming percentage of the voting public believes one way, but the legislators will vote in a different manner.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that actually supports the argument. They're using media to get to the right people, to make them protect their own thing, even though it's against the majority. And the majority usually is supposed to, as the majority, when we're mad, we're supposed to win. And we're not winning in that case for sure.
They've also made it a lot harder to pass a constitutional amendment by putting the 7-year limits on it. Like the ERA has come up the most with any amendment ever, but it hasn't passed and because it has a 7-year limit. I don't know, some state out west recently just passed it, but it doesn't really matter because
Yeah.
the last amendment that was actually passed was in '92, and it was one of the original 12 that were proposed in the Bill of Rights. And it was a college student who was like, failed a paper that said, you know, this is still out there, this can still be passed. And because it never had any limits on it, that's the most recent one, which was one of the original proposed Bill of Rights.
Fascinating. So the 7 year, I did not know that. There's the 7-year limit. Well,
And it's not actually written into the rules that it's a 7-year limit. It's one that Congress decided on its own.
fascinating. Yes, Beck.
I think there's also like a sense of inertia where the longer it's been since like, you know, we made a congressional amendment or a major change, the easier it is to fall back on the idea that it's solid, it is tradition, we've had it for a while. I think it's harder and harder to change because, you know, it's just been there for so long. And the fact that we've had, you know, this long since the last amendment makes it that much harder to change. As opposed to like, so we had an amendment to the Constitution last week, bringing up the fact that maybe we should have another amendment would be real easy.
Yeah, comfort level. We're just in it. This is us. This is who we are. Work the game or lose. So I'm going to run back to games real quick. So there was a moment in basketball, pretty famous moment, where early basketball game, you brought your own ref. Each team brought a ref. They go to New York City. They played this game. And with one ref, one of the players was getting pretty physical. And he destroyed the best player in the league, held him to like 6 points, lowest number of points in his career. The next day, the paper wrote, if we don't change the rules to basketball now, the sport is over. And within basically 48 hours, the equivalent of the NBA added the rule about the three-point lane violation. That came up because of one player in one game. We don't do that. We don't do that because it's always going to hurt somebody. We've lost the ability to become game designers because we're all game players, all of us. Would you support something that made the world more fair, made the country more fair, if it made your policy less likely to pass? And for all of you, I'm going to pick abortion, not that I'm picking a side on this, but think about how you feel about that issue. Would you be comfortable changing a rule that made it more likely the opposite of what you like would happen? And most of us say no. We have lost our ability to be game designers. We're all game players. And I hope that we can get back to being game designers.
Well, I would also argue that when you have the players writing the rules, and in this case, in politics, to me, the players, if we're using the game analogy, really are politicians. If we are the spectators, right? And having the players write the rules is always a terrible idea. If we let players patch games, they would just nerf everything but their favorite weapon, which they make infinite strong, and the game's boring, nobody wants to ever play it. And then you have this other side to it where the less that gets done, it's much harder to blame people for stuff that doesn't get done. And so if nobody ever does anything, it's much harder for anyone to ever lose their office, because you can't really say, it's much harder to say you didn't do this thing, therefore you're bad, than it is to point to a thing you did and say, look how horribly that went, you should be out of office.
All right, so great unintended consequence right along this line. Right now, and again, I'm not talking policy here, but in the Republican Party, we have a bunch of people in the Senate and the House who appear to be acting in a way that's odd, with their support for a president who they didn't like when he was first elected. But what's the job of a senator or representative? Represent which people? Yes, yeah, the ones who vote for them. They're victory points. We're victory points. We're voters. So, yeah, the ones line their pockets. So at what level should they act moral at the sacrifice of doing their job?
So I have a question for you, though. What do you say about the senators or congresspeople who are Republicans from states that did not vote for the current president, but are still acting with the president?
Well, yeah, they come from a smaller subset of voters.
Right.
So if you're a Republican who, in your district went Democrat, and your district also went Republican for you.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, you're probably not the one acting that way.
Yeah. Weirdly, we still have a lot of.
But my job is still to get done what I want to get done.
Right.
It's not about how I look morally. That's not my job. My job as a senator is not to be a moral person. My job is to get done what my voters want me to get done. And if that means debasing myself, debasing the country, particularly overseas, right? Because we talk about our Congress and and the Senate and the House as deliberative bodies that work on foreign policy in particular. We don't have constituents who vote in those countries, right? We don't. So why do they care what happens overseas? Like, they're literally, by rules, they score no victory points, essentially, by making life easier somewhere else. I'm not saying that's the right thing, but I'm saying what the rules encourage you to do. Let me hit you back there. No, second row back, yeah. No, that one, right there, you, yeah.
It sounds like with all your talking victory points, I think the thing to keep in mind is that you can't just win people, win votes, whatever, by going for something. You have to remember that if you go a different direction, you'll also lose. So what people are probably keeping in mind is that if I start making compromises, or if I'm seen to do something, I won't just maybe pick up people who are centrist or from across the aisle. I would also possibly lose the people who are more hardline. And even if I can't convince myself that the people in my district really are that hardline, I know that there are people who out there will say I'm a bad person and try to convince everyone in my district who might be more moderate that I'm just no good for them, and that what they really need is someone who's more willing to defend what they believe in and maybe leave it a little bit vague what they
Sure. So now we're entering the role of the realm of game theory now, right? Game theory is how do you play the rules to win, however you define winning. And that's what gets interesting, right? Because in game theory, there's a bunch of clever terms for what you're describing, basically the drunkard's walk, kind of madman in the room, right? If I need 52 votes to win, and I have 3 people who will only vote for me if I say I believe in aliens, and 49 people who will vote for me all the time, no matter what I say,
It's so weird.
guess what? I weirdly believe in aliens. Like, it's going to happen, right? And that's a game theory issue. That's why having a third party in this country has almost never, functionally never worked, right? And parties, by the way, do not exist in our legal systems. They are totally outside. We have regulations on them now, but they're nowhere in the Constitution. They're not a thing. They're a thing because we chose to make them a thing.
Well, so can we hop back to gerrymandering for a minute? Because I think that it's an interesting example of game system consequences. Since people wanted to start there, we're talking about why nothing is ever done, why we're becoming more polarized. And interestingly, you have this system where if you take a politician's goal as to be being reelected, right, and they get to rewrite the rules, and the way to get elected is have more people of your party in your district than have people of the opposing party in your district. Well, everybody rewrites because they get to rewrite the rules, rewrites their district to contain more and more people of their own party. But we now have this issue where in the past, when you had a fairly even distribution of people in any particular district, everybody had to compete for the people in the center, the people who might actually go one way or the other, right? But we eliminated that. They accidentally they intentionally eliminated that because they thought, oh, if I just make it all people of my party, well, then I'll win every time, and that's great. But because of a second system that they weren't really thinking around, which is our primary system, instead what happened is, well, now you have people coming in, and now it's a question of who can be more extreme of the views of that party. And so all these people who tried to lock in their seat, who were somewhat moderate, now can't be moderate. Now everybody has to out-extreme each other to win the primaries, to win the most hardcore, because the only people who show up for primaries are the most hardcore of the voters in the district. So the most hardcore of a party that they know is going to win in that area. And so a lot of Congress people actually lost themselves. If you look at the last 15 or so years of Congress and how much more divisive it's become, a lot of that's because we have people who have lost 2 primary challengers or who have resigned because they knew they were going to be beaten in the primary by people who are more extreme because of their own votes on how to sort of gerrymander their districts.
Yep.
And so it's this interesting set of systems that have nesting consequences. And like as with game designers, you can't just change one piece and not look at all the pieces that that's connected to. And then, of course, that all rolls out into a lot of other consequences that were happening today with a very polarized voting block in both the House and Senate.
And we, unfortunately, as a system, we're too resilient as a system. If we wanted to change something functional in our system without going to amending the Constitution, which takes forever and is probably never really going to happen again in our lifetimes, we do it through laws. But unfortunately, laws get tested on constitutionality, and then they don't pass that muster, and the Supreme Court shoots them down. So let's say we tried to pass a law right now that said we're gonna say states have to draw their lines based on this computer algorithm, right? Unconstitutional, absolutely unconstitutional. That law can't pass. So we created a system that is resilient to patching at all but the most extreme level. Yeah, it's a kind of a horrible catch-22. I will say, by the way, real quick, the game theory of this is your vote is more important in a primary most of the time than it is in a general election. So if you're someone who only votes in general elections, or you only have one vote a cycle that you're going to give, do it in the primary if you live in most districts. We go back there. Yeah.
One thing I think that's fractured in this country, not just primaries and such, is the lack of third parties. I think that one way would help in this section bridge the gap, because once people do say, okay, I'm going to vote for example, this election, a lot of people got a lot of negative.
Yep.
People just bash and saying that you are a betrayer.
Yeah, third, I'm going to take over real quick. So having third parties is fascinating because what happens in our country is whenever in Europe, the parties can be very one issue, right? The Green Party, right? The Green Parties are they're environmentalist party. And
Do you want to explain why that actually works in Europe, though? Like, what's the difference about how those people get elected compared to how they get elected here that systemically makes the Green Party or whatever?
Yeah, the voting systems are all different. Like there's proportionalized
right.
voting. Yeah.
First past the post system it creates the smaller effects. So
Yeah.
it makes a third party damage the party that it is ideologically most similar to.
Yeah, and in countries like Australia, you have like the second, third vote thing, where if your guy doesn't win, your politician doesn't win on the first choice, then you go to your second choice, and you have third choice voting, which is a really fun game design fix, actually, in my mind. I really like that one. But our third party problems are when a new issue comes out that would get a whole group of people super excited about saving the planet, because I don't know, that's kind of important. What happens? One party picks it, and they own it. And once they own it, it's the other party's, for some reason, job to disown it. I swear to God, if you just want to make someone look dumb in a political argument, pick a logical, obvious truth and just passionately defend the right to breathe air. And someone is going to say, can you believe this free air nonsense? Air should cost money. Like, it should totally happen. But yeah, third parties structurally are very tough too. So we have a system, again, although the parties are, like I said, a total add-on. But our voting process makes third parties tough. Even Bill Clinton's famous for triangulating, taking issues from another party in the middle where there could have been a rational thing to do. All right, let me go. Someone I haven't talked to. You, Fred.
Do you think having a system, like from a game design perspective for a country, do you think having a system where the rules can be changed by the players themselves, do you think that would could potentially be remedied by changing who can change the rules? Like, do you change that to, in this example, the spectators? Who should be allowed to change the rules? And if they are allowed to change the rules, what can and can't they do?
Well, go for it.
Oh, no, I was going to talk about the complexity of how do we get that to happen, right? Because if we don't actually get to vote on, say, changing the rules back to us, you would have to have the people who currently get to write the rules disenfranchise themselves in order for us to be able to do that. And so I think that we have created a system where I don't know how we walk it back. And I think that's part of the problem from where we're at.
Yeah. So if we were a sport, we'd have 7 or 8 teams playing in our league, and it'd be easy to change, even if it punished one group. We have 2. We have 2 teams. I think we're disasters away. And I don't mean to be a negative, a naysayer. I'm so happy to live in this country. It's amazing. My socks have American flags on them. I don't know if you can see that. But I do think that we're going to have some disasters before we get better. And I don't. Or we need like 80 George Washingtons.
Well,
we need. I mean, seriously. And you know what? Here's the thing. Game designers. We should run for office. I have one game designer friend. He's the only person I've ever given money to in politics. He fixed his small town in 2.5 years, saved them millions of dollars for taking the trashed, ridiculous system and changing it to a different. John Nephew, the guy who runs Atlas Games. It's amazing. And then he didn't. Then he got only stayed in office for 1 term and got voted out. But we're good at systems. Like, and there's been moments of brilliance in our system. Sorry, clear. I'll say something, but.
Oh no! I think you're correct. But before we pat ourselves on the back, I think that there is value also in the time that we have remaining to look at some of the updates, because we talked about us having a 200-year-old system, right? And other people, we're still playing Quake while everybody else is playing Overwatch, right? And so we should probably take a look at what they did in Overwatch and compare the two and see why they did it, right?
Yeah.
And one of my favorite examples is obviously always the way that in a parliamentary system a government can fall, right? We only have elections once every 4 years. Whenever, depending on the system, whether it's sometimes it's a budgetary vote, sometimes it's any major vote, a vote fails. That's why you see snap elections happen in a lot of other places. This was sort of a patch for, we have a government that can't do anything, that's hit gridlock, right? And we had, for example, when the Obamacare repeal failed, in a lot of countries that would trigger a new election. And we'd get a chance to vote on everybody. And when that failed, everybody would have had to have, all the people in Congress and Senate would have to have dealt with the consequences, and we would get to see their vote and make a choice based on that vote and the other votes they've made up to that point. So it was a system to avoid gridlock, and it was a system to sort of ensure that the government was always both successfully functioning and doing the will of the people, because every time that it fell apart or people felt it was politically expedient to block a vote, we had a new election. And then the other part of that is those snap elections are short, so we no longer have these 2-year media cycles. So now it's a vote about one thing that's very clear to everyone, and anyone who that matters to understands and goes out and votes.
Yeah.
But there's a whole bunch of these that we should look at the other democracies. As much as I love American democracy, there are things that have been built in the last 200 years that have been newer democracies that have thought through some of these problems, looking at us, and we should really examine them as game designers, like we would sequels to a game.
Yeah, our executive power is outlandish compared to the executive power of most executives in modern democracies. The example I like to use is cell phones. If you were building a country today, would you build landlines? You would never build a landline for a phone ever. We still have them and we still use them. And we'll protect them forever. Yes, middle back right there. Yeah.
Sorry, I think we do have 2 sets of voters, or 2 sets of players in this game, but it's not political parties, it's the voters and the politicians. And the voters are playing a finite game, they want to achieve a goal, They want to pass a law. They want to accomplish something. They want to make a change in a certain direction. And the politicians are playing an infinite game. Their goal is to just keep playing. They don't care if they do anything. They care if they keep getting the job, keep getting the job. So one team's playing an infinite game. The other team's playing a finite game. And when a team playing a finite game plays somebody playing an infinite game, the finite game loses every single time. Because all the other team is going to win is just keep playing. So it actually behooves them not to do anything.
Yeah, we have orthogonal games that exist and interact, and we have a lot of them, right? Every election is an orthogonal game. Every vote for a bill is a separate game. Every Supreme Court hearing is a separate game, and they are intertwined in some pretty insane ways. Yeah.
So that I've been thinking of this in like a couple of contexts that you've been bringing up, but is this game that we're talking about, or many of these games, are they competitive or cooperative?
Oh, they're all competitive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, I kind of feel like the eventual goal is essentially a kind of cooperative, like achievement or goal, but a lot of the microsystems are very competitive.
Yeah, we're a team game looking for results. So as game designers, we have a design objective. I want to make a game, and I want to skill test for speed, foot speed. So I invent track and field.
More of a cooperative game with some competitive modulations?
No. So let me run through this track example. We're playing track and field. I want to create a sport. I want it to be fun and exciting, and I want the skill that we test for to be speed. So I create track and field, and I make some rules. You can't punch the other player. You can't throw things at them. You have to stay in the lines, right? All of the rules that are in track and field that ensure that what we're testing for is speed. Our system is testing for the right idea. It's the ideas freely expressed to the people who then make the decision on what the best right idea is. So it's a competitive game of ideas, and the best idea wins, which should be good for should be good for most people, the majority of the people, right? There are always losers in a bill. So I do think we're a competitive game, but we're not testing for the right skill anymore. Like, we're really not testing for ideas. And there's nothing in the rules that say you have to. If I can just make you so mad you vote for somebody else, you're still a victory point. I still got you. It still works. Yeah.
So I guess I wanna bring up something that gentleman back there mentioned, as well as Jane mentioned, is that politicians, their end game, their goal is re-election. Their goal is not make people happy. Mm-hmm. And I understand that their goal kind of has to be re-election, because that's how victory points work. That's how the job works. Like, you can't be a politician and expect to only have one term, right? Like, I mean, I guess maybe you could.
Yeah.
How do we fix that system so that their end point won't get the most votes, it's make people the most happy?
So what you're leaning towards is term limits, one of the things you just said. And we don't have term limits, and there's a reasonable argument to say that it's not just not in our Constitution, but it is unconstitutional. And I think it would come out as unconstitutional if they tried to pass a law about term limits in the House and the Senate. Only because the House and the Senate, they serve their states. There's a huge separation of powers issue. The state gets to decide how they send people to the House and to the Senate. So that would probably end up unconstitutional. But I don't think anyone in power is going to say, you know what a great rule addition would be? Me not being able to keep my job.
Well,
yeah.
And that's what runs the issue. I mean, again, we have the people playing the game, making the rules.
Okay, yeah, so let's say...
That's the biggest issue to me.
You talk about victory points, and we are victory points. As voters, we're victory points. I am just as happy to get you to vote for me as I am to get you not to vote for him. It's the same margin of victory. So when you think, I'm voting for this person because I want them to do something, nope. I might not vote. I might vote for the other person because I hate them. Because I've been so depressed from seeing these ads, I don't even vote. Like, it's a win for me if I get one of my opponent's voters not to vote. And that's a weird subjugation of the kind of thing that we're talking about. But that's an unintended consequence. I want to stop real quick and talk about what I think was some of the most genius game designer fixes that we have in our Constitution. And one of them is on a touchy subject, but I like it as a game design mechanic. Please, this is not a political statement or what I actually believe. But in the writing of the original Constitution, they had,
God, are you about to go?
Yeah. they had this great issue. Well, not great issue. They had this issue. The southern states were like, we know the northern states.
Terrible solution. This is
no. It's not the 3/5 vote one.
Okay, good. Because I was like, that's a kick it down the road one.
No. But this is another kick it down.
I was about to say, I am probably getting off the path we're about to vote.
No. So the idea was, are we going to look at slavery now? And this was somewhere in was it an amendment? I think it was the 13th, 14th Amendment, one of them. And they said, we're not going to look at this issue for 15 or some number of years. They put it up. Yeah, okay, yes. They put a number of years on it. And it was a great way of saying, and this is how I think a game designer could fix some of these issues we said. If we said, look, we are going to change to proportional voting in 24 years, right? Would anyone currently in office vote against that? Because they're probably not going to be there in 24 years.
Well, the problem is, though, that in 20 years, that office, the people in that office are going to repeal or change that. This is the problem that we've had with a lot of the rules.
But it didn't happen in that. So in that case, it went just as expected, right? The time ran out, and then we had a civil war because, yeah.
Right, I feel like that's not, there we go.
Hey, got to pull the Band-Aid off, man.
Can I go back to, real quick, before we get to the rest of the constitutional stuff, you had this question about, okay, how do we fix this? And I think that there are a lot of problems to do it in the non-abstract, but I think that one of the answers is changing our incentive systems, right? And the snap elections I was talking about, where if you fail to pass a major vote, is one of the things that changes the incentive systems for politicians to actually compromise and get stuff done. But there's plenty of others. Imagine if every senator or politician, imagine you could do a lot to reduce the amount of money that could be funneled to senator or politician. And now imagine if every senator's health care, every senator was just given the same health care that every U.S. citizen was given, right? I think we'd have a radical change relatively quickly in the average health care, right? Well, but right. So, but imagine if we could do a thing, and we'd have to look at this from, we'd have to figure out how to actually make it happen on another level. But imagine if we had the senator's salary be 3 times the mean income minus the top 10%, right? Right. And so there's the main problem, is that we have to find some way of overriding this. And so far it's mostly worked because we are very weird as a country. We are very much a pendulum country. We do actually swing from left to right. And basically every time that swing occurs, we have a lot of both. We have people rush in and do the opposite of what was done before. And those are the moments where you get some of that stuff where the party which is taking over by, we're going to fix the ills of the party that's been in power for a while. And then you get actual things that are not beneficial directly to those members of the House or Senate, except insofar as they're fulfilling campaign promises that will win them the next election, right?
Yeah. So there are social movements that work. Like if there was a strong social movement that said, it would take, the one good thing about our outsized president, right? Mm-hmm. If you're going to see real change, it'll be from a president. It'll be from a president who says something like, I ran on this thing. I'm going to run on the Walmart standard. The Walmart standard used to be, if you were a business person and you wanted to sell to Walmart, you went into a room, you couldn't shake the hands of the person behind the desk because they didn't want any money to pass hands under it. The buyer at Walmart, if they decide to carry your water bottles, you're rich. And they knew the incentives were wrong. So we could put that standard on senators. They're on camera 24/7. Everything they do was public. And if we had a president run on, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do this thing. And if that president wins, that president could say, I'm going to veto every single bill until you give me that bill. Every single bill. Our president is outrageously overpowered. I mean, imagine a Congress that's 55-45, and the president says, what, are you going to override my veto? Are you going to work together? Well, if you're going to work together, then we'll probably get a reasonable bill. I guess that one will pass me. Every other bill, I'm vetoing unless it says Walmart standard. Right? That's not we're at game theory maximum starting now. We're getting really good at running this game.
So I think I actually have an answer to your question. The answer is we need a bunch of us. We need people who don't want to actually be part of politics to go run, win, fix it, and leave. Because I'm sure there's a lot of us in this room who have thought about it, who I think could win actually your state or local elections, certainly House elections. House elections are, we talked about 11,000 to 11,000, right? You can win that on very little money. Some of them get a huge amount poured in, but you can still actually, what was that?
That's a state house.
Yeah.
Was that that's where we start. Sure,
yeah.
Sure.
Different. Orders of magnitude.
Yes, but all of the less than statewide elections, I think you can actually currently win. And we need people to go in who don't want to be politicians to go fix the system is actually what needs to happen.
That's why we have politicians in the first place. Because the scientists do science, the plumbers plumb, and the lawyers lawyer.
Sort of. We don't, I mean, all the politicians were not politicians before they were politicians, right? All of them came from other areas. For the most part, like, I mean, a lot of them were doctors or lawyers or other things beforehand. You have very few people who leave college and go enter and become a politician, right?
You have ex-soldiers who come back and become politicians, right?
Right.
There's a lot of paths that lead you to successful business people become politicians. People get.
But fashion design doesn't often lead to politics, nor does game design, nor does...
I don't know. I mean, movie star does, right?
So it should be the most famous game person in this room that should run.
No.
Do you see it as an issue that the goal of the first half of a game after every pendulum swing is undoing all of the victories of the previous game that we played?
Yeah, and that has not always been the case, right? That has not always been the case.
I don't know.
Yeah. So I want to talk real quick about what cheating is. Just super short version of cheating as a game designer. Cheating is simply rules tell you what you can do, what you must do, and they exist in this world of accepted norms. There's no rule in chess that says I can't punch you in the face, right? Because that's a dumb rule. In hide and go seek, there's a rule that says you have to close your eyes while you count because that's odd, right? So if there's a rule that breaks a social norm, it'll be explicitly put in there. Where I think we're falling apart down as a game now is both on, we have design issues, but we have enforcement issues too. We have issues of enforcing social norm breaking. So, because it is cheating, right? Some of the things that are happening now that people are saying there's no rule against this, the social norm is still a rule. I would throw the penalty flag in chess if someone punched me in the face. I'd say that's cheating. And we have people breaking long-standing social norms on both parties. I'm not pointing fingers here, to win, because the enforcers. We talk about writing the rules for yourself. We have another issue. Who enforces the rules on yourself? Who writes the rules for the Senate? The Senate writes their own rules. How do you think that's going to go on enforcement? Like, not very well.
Well, I mean, they actually enforce most of their own ethics committee is most of the enforcement for themselves. So,
Yeah. But the filibuster rule they can change whenever they want. You think that's it was a long-standing tradition, and then it wasn't, and we all just went, look, that just happened. It was the veto was 66, then it was 60, then it was we don't even have to say we're vetoing, or the filibuster rule was like you used to be able to have to stand and talk, and then you didn't. And sometimes those things become the new social norms.
well, I mean, the idea of blocking a Supreme Court nominee, right, is one of those things that. But the problem is that in a situation as polarized as we are, violating the social norms will benefit one side or the other. And then everyone on that side is incentivized to say, oh, but that's acceptable, which then, because it wasn't codified in the rules, sort of moves the actual social norm, right? Yeah. At that point, right, as we keep moving the Overton window, since it's never, do we ever codify these social norms, or how do we ever deal with it where we have an implicit rule that people are incentivized to violate, and the problem is the people who are incentivized to violate it, in some ways we are the enforcers, right? We can vote them out of office, we can do all these things. But as enforcers, we are also incentivized to let them break these rules if they're on our side, and that's the problem with being so polarized.
Yeah. I'm sorry, someone had. Let me go to someone I haven't gone to. Way in the back over there. Let's go that. Yeah, way in the back, right there. Sure. So what's the game patch to fix money in politics? That's a great question. So I'll say the obvious. We have a hard time with that based on the resiliency of our system I mentioned earlier. It's currently unconstitutional to stop somebody from spending money however they want because money is speech. right? And but there's probably a fix in your mind about how to fix money in politics.
Oh, gee, thanks for tossing this one to me.
I have a fix, but it's eliminate all money.
It's pretty good.
No,
I like it.
It's shorten the election cycle would be the thing, but that's hard to do because we have such scheduled elections.
We'll end our election cycle because we have scheduled elections. Our election cycle has nothing to do with when the election is, and it gets longer every year. I have always felt that it's something of a myth, right? It's not to me who gets the most money because it wasn't in this last presidential election, right? It's who gets the most airtime, essentially, and money buys that. But really, that's what money does, or media space, whatever you want to call it, cultural consciousness, whoever occupies the most of that wins. And there are alternate paths to it. We've seen some very unfortunate ones of late, but there are other ways to capture that zeitgeist other than simply spend money to convince us all. And so I think we need to start exploring and looking at when that's been successful and how it was done.
Yeah, I think getting rid of money in politics is the two weird challenges we have is money is speech and companies are people, right? And when you combine those two things, it gets actually weirdly more toxic because I don't have to give money to a politician anymore. So you can limit the amount of money I can give you. That's fine. I'll start my own radio show. We have 5 minutes here, and I'll pump my own stuff. So before we leave this last 5 minutes, are you talking about the series? Can we?
Oh yeah, sure. Why not?
Okay, so weird. Explain. It's your thing.
Why are you pitching these things to me?
Yeah, because I talk too much.
So, last year, we had a very long and rambling late-night conversation, much along these lines. And since then, I have recruited this man to help do a mini-series on extra politics, which will be appearing in
some time.
Yes. In the indefinite future.
At some point in the future. So it's a much more detailed, much more small topics. This has been more of a big ranging conversation, but we still have time for some questions. I just feel like you need to plug the book when you're on the thing. Yeah, I do have a book coming out soon.
U.S. politics or international politics?
It's about the U.S. governmental system and how it racks up against game mechanics and game design concepts. There's no policy in it at all, but it does explain why we take actions we take.
U.S. government, how many stars?
U.S.
Right, this game rated.
Oh, I thought it was like 50. That's me on the
I was
flag.
going to say,
Yeah. What is it?
Wow.
I give this thing 50 stars.
would play again? Yes, no?
No, yeah. It dragged on at the end.
Right. It was good for a while. It had a bang opening.
Yeah, bang opening was pretty good. Yeah.
Perfect score.
5 out of 7. Yeah, let me go to the back there. I mispointed. Wait. Yeah, that's you. You. Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to ask is, what are your thoughts on the fact that, like, as a political system, like in politics, you can't exactly make an ironclad fence. Like, if you're designing, let's just say an MMO, and I set a sword stat to 2, or I decide, like, this is the path we're taking, and this is the way the hallways are going, that is set in stone, coded into the firmament itself. And, like, the players can't decide, no, this sword is actually the best one.
Yeah.
Screw you. Whereas in politics, like, I can make a rule saying all senators must wear clown outfits, but even if the law's in the books, it doesn't actually mean anything because
Yeah, it goes back to it. So you touch again on enforcement, and that our enforcement bodies have gotten weird. The FBI is one that I have to talk about real quick. The FBI is the only enforcement body theoretically that can investigate the president, and they work for the president. No game designer in the world would make that game. That is dumb. And the FBI is not in the Constitution. The FBI was added in the, 430s? Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for all the numbers, people, dyslexic folks up here. Yeah, so the FBI is a great example of that exact thing. You can make all kinds of rules and just choose not to follow them if you own the ref.
Well, I think the bigger problem is actually that any rule that is made can also be overturned by the next Congress, right? Or even by that Congress. And this is in some ways an untenable system, right? Because even if you did have a bunch of people come in, change the rules radically, if they weren't there long enough to cement those things in it, like they would just get flipped back.
Yeah, one of my favorite fixes there was when the senators voted to pass a law that says they can't vote for their own pay raises.
Yeah.
So
that's the most recent constitutional amendment, isn't it?
Oh, is that it? Yeah.
Yeah. They can, but they can vote for it the next cycle.
Next cycle, yeah.
That's the most recent constitutional
Yeah,
amendment.
so it took us to be the amendment that said senators can't vote for their. I mean, we had to have a constitutional amendment about money. I mean, and who can like that amendment literally affects 100 U.S. citizens.
Right.
That's the Constitution that runs our entire country, and it took a constitutional amendment to basically say you can't just give yourself all the money you want to give yourself. People, please. Like, it's crazy.
Although all we said is you can't right now give yourself the amount of money that you have to make a pay raise for after the next election.
Yeah.
Which gives you even more incentive to maintain your
It's true.
position at all costs.
Yeah, and honestly, that's kind of outdated now because so many senators are millionaires now to the ridiculous. I mean, the
So
amount
you
of
know
money in
what's
the Senate
truly
is-
ridiculous. Any fundraising that you do, the war chest that your campaign does, your campaign is Function LLC, and you get to keep the money that you raise over the course of being a senator or a congressman. So a lot of people exit Congress with $1 million for their next election campaign that people have donated to them that they just keep, right? Right.
What? Yeah, so that money you can keep. You can keep the money for your the money you raise to throw your your I'm a president party.
Oh.
Yeah, you can keep that money. Yeah, there's so many ways to put money in someone's pockets. It's insane. We should have the Walmart standard. I don't think I've gone to you yet.
With all this time enforcement, I think there's one thing that we may have sort of missed or left out, particularly when we're talking about enforcement of social norms.
Yeah.
And that is media, in particular news media, and the fact that news media has also weakened for a lot of reasons.
Sure.
Mostly because people don't pay for it and they get it online and other things, and so media is having to look towards polarization in order to draw eyeballs, and that has its own consequences.
Yeah, our free press was so far advanced that the founding fathers could not possibly comprehend the power of the press today. It was powerful back then. They sent flyers around. What do they call them? Little pamphlets. They did those things, the leaflets. They did all that stuff. But man, I mean, our media is danger powerful. We're getting better at playing games. We're getting better at manipulating people. In the 50s, there was a legitimate worry that the madmen, the marketing people on Madison Avenue, were using mind control tactics to get you to do things you didn't want to do. All those jingles that we still know, plop, plop, fizz, fizz from the 50s, right? And they hired ex-German scientists to help write things that were super catchy for people. And we were terrified at the time. Now, turns out that's pointless. But we're at that point.
Or so we've been told.
Now we're at that time, and I feel like I need an Alka-Seltzer for some reason I don't know.
We are over time.
Yeah.
There's so much more we want to talk about
Yes.
this, but yeah. Come hang out. We're doing a panel. X-Credit's doing a panel at 9. Afterwards, we have just a space for conversations, and we probably will end up picking up some of this again then. So
yes.
hopefully we'll see you all then.
Thank you.